I was born in the shadow of the palace, though I never saw it. That's what they told me, at least the administrators who processed my birth documentation, who stamped my ration chit, who assigned my HAB block designation before I could even open my eyes. Sublevel 4477, District Gamma 88, Hive Primus Australis. The numbers meant nothing to me then. They mean everything now. They are all that remains of what I was, carved into the databanks of the administratum like a gravestone that was erected before I died. I have lived my entire existence beneath 10,000 meters of habitation, industry, and compressed humanity. And I will die here too, though whether my body will be rendered down for protein paste or simply left to desiccate in some forgotten maintenance tunnel, I cannot say. Perhaps it doesn't matter. Perhaps nothing has ever mattered except the vast, grinding machinery of the Imperium, and I have always been nothing more than a single cog-tooth, worn smooth by friction, waiting to be replaced. The air on the Throneworld tastes of incense and rust. That's the first thing you learn when you take your first breath, that you can remember when you're old enough to be separated from the creche mothers and assigned to the juvenat work gangs. The recyclers pump atmosphere through filters that were blessed by the Mechanicus 10,000 years ago, and those blessings have long since faded into corrosion. The oxygen is thin, stretched across too many billions of souls, rationed like everything else. You can taste the prayers of the dead in every inhalation, the accumulated exhalations of 100 generations who lived and died in these same corridors. The incense is meant to sanctify, to purify, to remind us that we dwell in the holiest place in all the galaxy, but all it does is coat your tongue with a waxy bitterness and make your eyes water in the perpetual gloom. Sometimes, when the ventilation systems malfunction, which happens with the regularity of a heartbeat, the smell changes. Then you can detect the undertones, machine oil thick enough to choke on, the sweet rot of organic waste imperfectly processed, the acrid tang of ozone from overloaded power conduits, and underneath it all, the smell of too many human bodies pressed into too little space, the musk of fear and resignation that no amount of devotional incense can mask. I was 6 standard years old when I learned that the sun existed. Not from seeing it. Of course, the layers of habitation between my level and the surface are so vast that only the hyper-elite ever glimpse natural light. No, I learned it from an education servitor, its human face slack and drooling, its eyes replaced with crude visual receptors that glowed a dull red in the darkness of the instruction chamber. The servitor's voice was flat, mechanical, almost completely stripped of human inflection, as it described something called a star, something that produced light without promethium, without plasma cores, without the blessing of the machine god's secrets. I thought it was lying. I reported it to the proctor, a dried-out woman whose face was tattooed with devotional scripture, and she struck me across the mouth hard enough to loosen a tooth. "The Astronomicon," she hissed, her breath smelling of sacra leaves and decay, "is lit by the God Emperor's will. That is the only star that matters. That is the only light you will ever need." My tooth fell out 3 days later. I kept it for years, a small piece of bone in my pocket, a reminder that truth was whatever the administratum said it was, and questioning led only to pain. The work began when I was 8. We were all 8. The entire cohort of sublevel 4477, District Gamma 88, born within the same standard month and processed through the same assessment protocols. We lined up in our thousands in a corridor that stretched beyond the limits of my vision in both directions, our heads freshly shaved, our bodies wrapped in coarse, grey, synthetic fibre that chafed against skin that had never felt anything softer. The overseers walked among us with shock molds and data slates, their faces hidden behind rebreather masks that made them look like insects, like the servitors they would someday become if they failed their duties. They measured us height, weight, bone density, reflexes. They examined our teeth, our eyes, our fingers. They took samples of our blood and fed them into portable cogitators that hummed and clicked and spat out streams of parchment covered in binary code. Some children were marked with green ink on their foreheads and led away. I never saw them again, but I heard rumors later that they were taken to the upper levels, to the scolums where they trained administrators and junior functionaries. Others were marked with red and dragged screaming toward the industrial sectors, where the manufacturing complexes devoured human labor like a furnace devours coal. I was marked with yellow. The overseer who painted the symbol on my forehead didn't speak, didn't look at me, simply moved on to the next child in line. Yellow meant the scriptorums. Yellow meant a life bent over data slates and parchment, transcribing endless documents whose purpose I would never understand, checking calculations that would determine resource allocations for worlds I would never visit, verifying tithe assessments for populations I would never meet. Yellow meant my body would be spared the worst of the physical degradation, but my mind would slowly fossilize under the weight of meaningless numbers and ritualized bureaucracy. The scriptorium where I spent the next 40 years was a cavern carved from the living rock of the planet itself, its ceiling lost in shadow somewhere far above, supported by pillars as thick as hab towers that were covered in devotional inscriptions. 10,000 desks arranged in perfect geometric rows, each one occupied by a scribe hunched over their work, each one illuminated by a single flickering lumen globe that cast more shadows than light. The sound was constant, overwhelming, a rustling whisper that filled every cubic meter of space, the scratch of styluses on parchment, the tap of fingers on data slate keys, the rustle of pages being turned, the occasional cough or whimper quickly suppressed. We worked in shifts that lasted 14 hours, with brief breaks for rations and waste elimination, and we slept in dormitories stacked 6 high in coffin-sized bunks, where the air was so thick with human heat that you woke gasping, your lungs straining against the oppressive atmosphere. I learned to sleep with my mouth open, learned to ignore the sounds of sobbing and prayer and occasional violence that echoed through the darkness. I learned to retreat so far inside my own skull that my body became nothing more than a machine for converting nutrient paste into completed forms. The work itself was madness disguised as order. I transcribed production quotas for manufactorums on worlds whose names I couldn't pronounce. I verified casualty assessments from military campaigns that had been concluded for centuries, but whose final death tolls were still being calculated, still being cross-referenced, still being adjusted for clerical errors that compounded across generations of record-keeping. I filled out requisition forms for equipment that no longer existed, for regiments that had been destroyed decades ago. Because the forms themselves had been filed and could not simply be discarded, they had to be processed, had to be completed, had to be archived in the great data vaults that honeycomb the bedrock beneath the palace. Every number I wrote was checked by another scribe, and their work was checked by yet another, and on, in an infinite regression of verification and counter-verification, because the administratum trusted nothing and no one, not even itself. Errors were punished. A misplaced decimal point could mean a flogging. An incorrectly calculated sum could mean ration reduction for your entire work cohort. A serious mistake, a lost document, a damaged data slate could mean servitorization, your brain scooped out and replaced with simple cogitation circuits, your body repurposed into a mindless machine that would continue the work you had failed to complete competently while human. I was 32 when I first saw someone become a servitor. Her name was Kala. Though we weren't supposed to use names, we were supposed to use our designation codes, our alphanumeric strings that identified us in the grand ledgers of the administratum. But in whispers, in the darkness of the dormitories, we used names, held onto that small shred of identity like a drowning person clutching driftwood. Kala had made a mistake. She had transposed 2 numbers in a resource allocation document. had written 1.4 million units instead of 4.1 million units, and that error had propagated through 17 subsequent documents before it was caught by a quality control auditor. The punishment was swift and clinical. She was taken from her desk during the middle of a shift, her screams echoing through the scriptorium and causing hundreds of scribes to flinch and hunch lower over their work, desperate not to look, desperate not to be noticed. They brought her back 3 days later. Her face was slack, her eyes dead and glassy, her skull opened and crudely resealed with metal staples that wept thin lines of infection. Mechanical appendages had been grafted to her spine, data probes, and input jacks that allowed her to interface directly with the cogitators. She was seated at a desk in the same row where she had worked before, and she began transcribing with the mindless efficiency of a machine, faster than any human could work, her fingers moving in blurring precision while drool leaked from the corner of her mouth and her chest rose and fell with breaths that were no longer her own. She worked that way for 6 years before she finally broke down, her organic components failing, her body collapsing over her desk and voiding itself, while the mechanical parts continued to twitch and spar. They removed her during a meal break and brought in a replacement servitor the next day. No one spoke about it. No one dared. The Throneworld is dying, but it dies so slowly that you don't notice unless you're old enough to remember how things used to be. The power outages become more frequent, the periods of darkness stretching from minutes to hours, and we work by the light of candles that drip hot wax onto our documents and require us to transcribe everything again once the lumens finally flicker back to life. The rations grow thinner, the nutrient paste watered down until it's little more than flavored gruel that leaves your stomach cramping with hunger even after you've consumed your full allotment. The recyclers fail with increasing regularity, and the air becomes so foul that you tie cloth across your face just to make it through your shift without vomiting. The corridors crumble, chunks of rockcrete falling from the ceiling and crushing whoever is unlucky enough to be beneath them, and the bodies are left where they fall for days, sometimes weeks, until work crews finally arrive to haul them away to the rendering plants. The maintenance servitors malfunction, wandering the halls aimlessly, sometimes attacking people at random with their industrial tools, and we learn to press ourselves against the walls when we hear their heavy footfalls approaching, to make ourselves small and insignificant and unworthy of attention. The temperature fluctuates wildly. Sometimes the heating systems overload, and the air becomes thick and sweltering, sweat soaking through your robes and leaving salt stains that never wash out. And other times the heat fails completely, and you wake with frost on your blankets, your breath misting in the air, your fingers so numb you can barely hold your stylus. I was 45 when the pilgrim influx began. The overseers told us that holy visitors were arriving from across the Imperium, coming to the Throneworld to fulfill vows of devotion, to lay eyes upon the palace even though they would never be permitted within its walls, to pray in the direction of the golden throne even though they would never be allowed close enough to feel its radiance. Thousands became millions, and millions became billions, and the infrastructure that was already failing under the weight of the permanent population began to buckle and tear. New arrivals were packed into every available space, into disused storage chambers, into abandoned transit tunnels, into sections of the hive that had been condemned centuries ago, but were suddenly reopened because there was nowhere else to put the endless tide of humanity that flowed toward the holiest world in the galaxy. They brought disease with them, plagues that should have been caught by the orbital quarantine stations but somehow slipped through, and people began dying in numbers that overwhelmed even the rendering facilities. The bodies piled up in the corridors, wrapped in whatever cloth could be found, marked with devotional prayers, and left to decay because there were no work crews available to remove them. The smell was indescribable, a thick, sweet putrescence that saturated every surface, that clung to your clothes and your hair, that flavored your food and your water until everything tasted of death. We kept working. What else could we do? The administratum required our labor, and to stop working was to invite punishment worse than the plague, worse than starvation, worse than the slow suffocation of too many bodies breathing too little air. The prayers never stopped. That was the worst of it, I think, looking back now from this place where I await my final disposition. The prayers were constant, a droning murmur that rose from the throats of billions of souls like the sound of insects, like the hum of machinery, permeating every moment of existence until you couldn't remember what silence sounded like. They prayed in the corridors, in the work chambers, in the dormitories, in the waste reclamation facilities. They prayed in High Gothic and Low Gothic, in languages I didn't recognize, in made-up tongues that mixed devotional liturgy with local dialects into incomprehensible hybrid chants. They prayed to the God Emperor to preserve their souls, to grant them strength, to forgive their unworthiness, to accept their suffering as devotion. They prayed with their voices and with their bodies, kneeling on the cold metal floors until their knees bled, pressing their foreheads against devotional icons until their skin split, flagellating themselves with improvised whips made from power cables and synth leather straps. The pilgrim who died at my desk had prayed himself to death. He had collapsed beside me during a shift, his lips still moving through the litanies, his eyes rolled back in his skull, and I had stepped over him and continued my work, because to stop was to risk being noticed, to risk being questioned, to risk joining him in the piles of corpses that grew taller every day. At 50, I was promoted. It wasn't a reward. There are no rewards in the administratum, only the temporary postponement of inevitable decline. A senior scribe 3 desks down from mine had died, simply pitched forward onto his data slate with a small sigh, and after the body was removed, I was moved to his position. The work was identical. The desk was identical. The only difference was that my alphanumeric designation changed, adding a new prefix that indicated my seniority, my supposed authority over the junior scribes, who now filled the rows behind me. The promotion came with a private bunk instead of a shared one, a coffin-sized space with a door that closed, and a lumen globe I could control myself. It also came with additional responsibilities. I was now required to verify the work of 20 other scribes, to catch their errors before those errors propagated through the system, to report serious mistakes to the overseers, who would then make their terrible decisions about punishment and correction. I became complicit in the machinery of suffering. I marked forms with red ink that indicated errors, knowing that those marks would lead to floggings, to ration reductions, to servitorization. I told myself I had no choice. I told myself I was simply fulfilling my duty. I told myself the lies that everyone tells themselves when they become part of the apparatus of oppression, when they trade the suffering of others for their own marginal comfort. The rebellion happened when I was 58. I didn't know it was a rebellion at first, just an unusual commotion, a disturbance in the normal rhythms of suffering and labor. The sound of gunfire echoed through the corridors, distant at first but drawing closer, the sharp crack of las weapons, and the deeper boom of more serious armaments. The overseers evacuated the scriptorium in a panic, herding us toward the emergency shelters, shock mauls swinging at anyone who moved too slowly or asked questions. We huddled in the darkness of a disused storage chamber for 3 days, packed so tightly we couldn't sit down, couldn't move, could barely breathe. The air grew hot and stale. People fainted. Some died standing up, held upright by the press of bodies around them, their deaths going unnoticed until their bowels released and the smell finally alerted those nearby. We could hear the fighting above us, the rumble of explosions that shook dust from the ceiling, the screaming that rose and fell like waves. When we were finally released, when the overseers returned and herded us back to our desks, the corridors were different. Scorch marks blackened the walls. Blood had pooled in the low spots and dried to a sticky brown crust. Bodies had been stacked like cordwood in intersections, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, marked with symbols I didn't recognize, 8-pointed stars, profane glyphs that hurt to look at. The overseers wouldn't tell us what had happened. They just told us to work, to make up for lost time, to increase our output to compensate for the 3 days of disruption. Later, in whispers, we learned that a cult had risen in the lower levels, that workers had turned against the Imperium, that they had been put down with the ruthless efficiency that is the only response the administratum knows. The ringleaders were crucified in the main transit hubs, left hanging for weeks as warnings, their bodies slowly consumed by vermin, while servitors continued their work around them, stepping over the pooling fluids without pause. I began to change after that, though I didn't realize it was happening until much later. Something in me broke, or perhaps something finally woke up that had been sleeping for 58 years. I started making mistakes. Small ones at first, a digit transposed here, a calculation slightly wrong there, errors that I caught and corrected before submitting my work. But the mistakes grew more frequent, more significant. I began to wonder if I was making them deliberately, if some part of my mind had decided that the entire edifice of the administratum was itself an error, a monumental mistake that had calcified over 10,000 years into an institution that served no purpose except its own perpetuation. I looked at the forms I was completing and saw only waste, resources diverted from worlds that needed them to support bureaucratic apparatus that produced nothing except more bureaucracy. Human lives measured in units of labor potential and then discarded when that potential was exhausted. An entire civilization that had forgotten what it was building toward, that simply maintained the machinery of its own existence without asking why, without considering if there might be another way, without even remembering that alternatives had ever existed. The auditor who caught my mistake was younger than me, a woman whose face was already developing the pinched, suspicious look that all senior administrators eventually acquired. She held up the form I had completed, marked now with red ink, her lips compressed into a thin line. "This is a serious error," she said, her voice flat and cold. "This allocation discrepancy could affect supply lines to 3 frontier sectors. Do you understand the magnitude of your failure?" I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I spoke without calculation, without considering the consequences. "Does it matter?" I asked. The silence that followed was total. Every scribe within earshot had stopped working, their hands frozen over their data slates, their heads turned just slightly in our direction while they pretended not to listen. The auditor's face flushed, anger and shock warring across her features. "Does it matter?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You question the work of the administratum? You question your duty to the God Emperor?" I should have recanted. I should have begged forgiveness. I should have prostrated myself and pleaded for mercy. Instead, I heard myself say, "I question everything." They took me that same hour. 2 arbitrators in black armor, their faces hidden behind helmets that made them look inhuman, their hands heavy on my shoulders as they marched me from the scriptorium. I heard Kala's voice in my memory, her screams echoing down through the decades, and I knew my fate was sealed. But they didn't take me to the servitorization chambers, they took me deeper instead, down corridors I had never seen, past checkpoints where armored guards checked their data slates and waved us through, descending through levels whose numbers grew higher and whose conditions grew worse, until we finally arrived at a chamber that smelled of disinfectant and fear. An inquisitor was waiting there. Though I didn't know his title then, I only saw a man in a black coat covered in purity seals, his face scarred and weathered, his eyes like chips of ice. He studied me for a long time without speaking, walking around me in a slow circle while I stood with my hands bound, my heart hammering against my ribs. Finally, he spoke. "You are guilty of ideological corruption," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "You have questioned the divine order of the Imperium. You have spoken heresy in the presence of witnesses. The punishment for this is death, or worse than death." He paused. "Let that sink in. However, I am curious. How does one live 58 years in service to the administratum and only now discover doubt? What changed?" I didn't answer at first. What could I say? That I had finally noticed the smell of incense couldn't cover the smell of rot. That I had realized the prayers were just noise, meaningless syllables repeated until they lost all connection to whatever divinity they supposedly invoked. That I had seen too many people become servitors, had seen too many corpses piled in corridors, had seen too many children marked with colored ink and sent to their assigned fates. But the Inquisitor waited, patient and still, and eventually I spoke. "Nothing changed," I whispered. "It was always like this. I just finally admitted it." He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already suspected. "The Imperium," he said, "is not kind. It is not just. It does not pretend to care for the individual. It is a machine of survival, nothing more. It grinds up human lives and converts them into the minimal amount of order necessary to forestall complete annihilation. You have lived your entire life inside that machine, and now you have the audacity to complain about being ground up." He leaned closer, and I could smell the sacre on his breath. "But here is what you don't understand, what you cannot understand, because you are too small to see it. Every form you filled out, every calculation you verified, every mistake you caught, those were not meaningless. They were threads in a web that spans the entire galaxy. You were a synapse in a nervous system so vast that your mind cannot encompass it, and when you question that system, when you doubt its purpose, you risk unraveling everything." He showed me then, though I wish he hadn't. He took me deeper still, into chambers that had been carved from the bedrock of the planet itself, into archives that stretched beyond the limits of sight in every direction. He showed me shelves that held documents 10,000 years old, records of the Imperium's first days, when the Emperor had walked among humanity and imposed order on the chaos of old night. He showed me cogitation engines the size of buildings, their data cores containing the collective knowledge and experience of 1,000,000 human worlds. He showed me the price of that order, stacks of casualty reports, lists of dead so long they had to be stored on entire data vaults, recordings of wars that had consumed entire sectors and left nothing but debris and silence. "This is what we preserve," he said, gesturing to the vast archives. "This is what your work sustains, not happiness, not justice, not anything so naive as fairness. We preserve survival. We preserve continuation. We keep the species alive for one more day, one more year, one more century, in the desperate hope that someday, somehow, things might become different. That is the bargain. That is the deal every human being in the Imperium has made, whether they know it or not. Your suffering in exchange for the possibility, not the guarantee, just the possibility that humanity might endure." I understood then, or thought I did, and the understanding was worse than ignorance. I saw the trap that had been constructed over 10,000 years, a machine so vast and so total that there was no escaping it, no way to refuse participation, no alternative except extinction. The Imperium was not evil in the way I had imagined. It was not a corrupt system that could be reformed, not a temporary tyranny that might eventually fall. It was the inevitable result of humanity's attempt to survive in a galaxy that was fundamentally hostile to its existence. Every cruelty had a reason. Every brutality was justified by necessity. Every individual crushed beneath the wheels of bureaucracy was crushed because that was the only way to keep those wheels turning, and if the wheels stopped, everything would collapse into the kind of darkness that makes servitorization look like mercy. The pilgrim who had died at my desk had understood this better than I had. He had prayed because prayer was all that was left when you truly comprehended the horror of the situation, when you realized that you were part of something you could neither escape nor change, when you understood that your only choice was between complicity and annihilation. The Inquisitor gave me an option, which was more mercy than most heretics received. I could accept servitorization, my mind stripped away, my body repurposed, my labor continuing without the burden of consciousness or doubt. Or I could accept penitence, a form of punishment that would allow me to retain my humanity, such as it was, while still serving the Imperium's needs. I chose penitence because I was a coward, because I wanted to keep thinking even if thinking brought only anguish, because I couldn't quite surrender the small spark of self that remained after 58 years of grinding labor. They brought me here, to this penal facility buried deep in the hive, where heretics and criminals and ideological deviants are sent to perform the work too dangerous or too degrading, even for servitors. We sort through toxic waste with our bare hands, separating materials that can be reclaimed from materials that must be destroyed. We crawl through crawl spaces too narrow for armored servitors, repairing conduits and power lines while the energy still runs through them, our bodies convulsing from electric shock while we work. We enter chambers flooded with radiation to retrieve documents or equipment that can't simply be abandoned, knowing that each exposure brings us closer to the slow death of cellular breakdown. The life expectancy here is measured in months, not years, and the work never stops, never pauses, never grants mercy or respite. I have been here for 6 months. My hair has fallen out, my teeth are loose in my gums, my skin has developed lesions that weep clear fluid and never quite heal. I can taste blood when I swallow. I cough up things I don't want to examine too closely. My hands shake constantly now, making it difficult to grip tools, difficult to perform the intricate work of sorting and repair that is demanded of us. Soon, I will be too damaged to continue, and then I will be sent to the rendering plants after all, my body converted into protein paste to feed other workers who will eventually follow the same trajectory, ground up and recycled in an endless loop of consumption and waste. This is what it means to live on the Throneworld. This is the reality beneath the propaganda and the prayers, beneath the glory and the devotion, beneath the endless proclamations of mankind's manifest destiny among the stars. We are fuel. We are raw material. We are the meat fed into the machine to keep it running for one more day, one more year, one more century, sustained by nothing but the desperate hope that our suffering has meaning, that our sacrifice serves some greater purpose that we cannot see but must trust exists. And the terrible thing, the thing that haunts me in the few hours of darkness when we're allowed to rest, is that I still believe it. Despite everything I've seen, despite everything I've endured, despite the clear evidence that the Imperium is a meat grinder that devours its own people with no more thought than a man crushing an insect, I still believe that it's necessary. I look at my fellow penitents, at their radiation-scarred faces and their trembling hands and their hollow eyes, and I see humanity's last stand against oblivion. I remember the archives the Inquisitor showed me, the endless records of wars and sacrifices and last stands, and I understand that this has been humanity's story for 10,000 years, not triumph, not glory, but survival purchased at the highest possible price. We endure because we have no choice. We serve because the alternative is extinction. We pray because prayer is the only comfort available when you finally comprehend how small you are, how meaningless your individual suffering is in the context of galactic survival, how the only choice available is between dying with purpose or dying without it. The Overseer is calling us back to work now. My shift has ended, but they need additional hands in one of the toxic reclamation chambers, and refusal is not an option. My body is breaking down, but there is still labor it can perform, still tasks it can accomplish before final failure. I will descend into the depths one more time. I will sort through the waste and the poison and the refuse of the Imperium's endless consumption. I will expose myself to toxins and radiation and substances whose names I don't know and whose effects I can only imagine. And when I can no longer work, when my body finally surrenders to the accumulated damage, I will be taken to the rendering plants and converted into something useful. My proteins extracted and processed and redistributed, my minerals reclaimed and repurposed, every atom of my physical being recycled into the great machine of imperial existence. Nothing will be wasted. Nothing is ever wasted in the Imperium, except perhaps the dreams and hopes and small dignities that we carry inside us, those intangible things that cannot be measured or processed or converted into anything useful, those things that die with us and leave no trace, except the fading memory of other soon-to-die souls who knew us briefly before the machine consumed us both. This is what it means to live on the Throneworld. This is the price of Holy Terra. This is the reality of the most sacred world in all the Imperium, where billions live and die in darkness, where prayers rise like smoke toward a throne we will never see, where the God Emperor's light is filtered through 10,000 meters of habitation, until it reaches us as nothing but shadow and suffocation, and the endless grinding of machinery that will outlast us all, that will continue turning long after every one of us has been rendered down and forgotten, our names lost in databases too vast for any living soul to search, our lives reduced to alphanumeric strings in ledgers that will themselves eventually decay and be lost and cease to matter to anyone at all. This is service. This is devotion. This is all we have ever been and all we will ever be. Fuel for a fire that can never be allowed to go out, no matter how much it hurts to burn.